Hi, everybody. I'm Spam. This is how InfoSec skills can help you survive a pandemic. Thank you so much, Josh and Janice, for the introduction. Gonna talk a little bit about, I guess, InfoSec and hacker culture and how you can use the skills you already have to go ahead, survive, and thrive in a pandemic. Some of this stuff is going to be a little bit stream of consciousness, a little bit off the cuff. You know, bear with me a little bit with regards to that. But I think that there's a lot that hackers can bring to the table, a lot of skills, a lot of mindset that can be really, really applicable for reacting to a pandemic. So some of this talk came about from conversations I had before the pandemic, just discussing how for a lot of individuals in the hacker community, there's a lot of commonalities that we see that are totally outside of InfoSec strictly. So obviously a lot of folks know a lot of, culture, media, whatever, movies, music, TV shows, stuff like that, a lot of similarities. But there's also a lot of hobbies that I think you see folks getting interested in for similar reasons that they're interested in hacking. So one thing that I find particularly interesting in terms of a hobby is a lot of folks who are into hacking were into magic when they were younger. And I think the reason that folks were into magic tricks, maybe they're younger, and for a lot of folks also today, is for the almost exact same reasons. They are, you see something that is interesting, astounding, you don't quite understand it, but it's really, really cool. So you want to be able to do that yourself, and you want to be able to tear it apart and understand how it works, see how you could innovate on it, see what else you can do. But that mindset, that thinking, is something that is intriguing to folks in the hacker community. And the mindset is one of the things that's hardest to kind of teach people. And I think that mindset can be applied for reacting to a pandemic and make things, way, way better for everybody. So a lot of what we see in reaction to the pandemic is stuff like this: American catastrophe. How do we get here? Here's the news. The news is going to give me the answer to all of my, what I'm looking for. We know that this is not true. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, there's a lot of FUD out there. A lot of what we're seeing is just breeding fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I think we want to, cut through it and also see how we can bring a little bit of, certainty, a little bit of control, but also see where there's possibilities for innovation. But with that being said, one disclaimer: no one knows what they're doing. So I don't know what I'm doing. Most people alive today have never lived through a pandemic. So everybody's trying new things. So things aren't going to be perfect, but that's fine. This is absolutely, I think, where hackers thrive. We know that we're not going to understand all of what we're doing. We're going to figure it out as we go. We'll get some stuff right. We'll get some stuff wrong, but we will figure it out. And we shouldn't get discouraged if some aspect of what we're looking at is potentially failing along the way. We just go ahead and keep at it and make sure that we're going to go ahead and learn from the experience. So with that, the thing that I see overwhelmingly in people's approach outside of the hacker community to the pandemic that I think could use improvement is threat modeling. Basic threat modeling. If you look at how folks were preparing for the pandemic and how folks have approached their responses to dealing with the pandemic, where it was just critically obvious that folks were not taking the right things into account, is threat modeling. Individuals' threat modeling skills are way off. And even if I thought that they were not necessarily where they should be, the pandemic has proven without a shadow of a doubt that the average person is not great at threat modeling. But hey, as InfoSec professionals, as hackers, you can go ahead and do this. And actually, as I was preparing my slides yesterday, I came across this tweet from Lee Honeywell on Twitter, which really summarizes a lot of what I've been thinking about and people's approach to risk management and threat modeling as it relates to the pandemic. So this is in response to tweets, somebody talking about, hey, there's going to be, people need to prepare for another round of shelter-in-place orders in different states and different countries. Lin says, it says something that basically none of my professional peers in security, people whose job it is to manage risk, ever stopped sheltering in place. We have the advantage of being able to work from home, and most jobs require it, but the risk has yet to drop enough to stop sheltering. There's, it's right there. It summarizes so much of what I think I want to talk about here, where you go ahead and being able to step back and not just take a look at what's, the FUD that's out there, but taking a real look based on the evidence that's out there, the actual guidelines, and saying, okay, here is what I do. Here is where my exposure is. Here's my personal things, whether you're immunocompromised or have other things that put you potentially at risk, and you act accordingly. Some folks have not necessarily done that early on in the pandemic, and maybe they've relaxed over time. But if you are looking at things in a reasonable and responsible way, I think you're more likely to have gone ahead and done your risk analysis and realize that the risk has been fairly consistent. And so your approach has been fairly consistent. I know some friends of mine have actually said, friends who are not in InfoSec have said, like, hey, we're all doing this stuff and you're not, you're doing the exact same thing you were months ago. I'm like, well, yeah, I have my approach, I have my lines, I look at it, and I'm not afraid of reevaluating it. But the overall risk has not changed. So my approach isn't necessarily going to change unless there's some other factor that's coming into play. And with some of this, I know folks can get bound up. There's a lot of emotional attachment to certain things, and sometimes it can be difficult to separate, to bring in aspects of personal to business, business to personal with respect to this. But I think we'll all be better off if we can, I guess, detach a tiny bit to do an actual analysis of the risk if you're not already doing that, and make sure that your approach incorporates that when you're going ahead and figuring out how you're going to deal with something during a pandemic. And in terms of what we're doing in a response, fundamentals are key, whether it's in InfoSec or in how we're dealing with the pandemic. So many corporations get compromised, not from somebody dropping ODA on them. Most folks are not looking at, their threat model doesn't include a nation state where they're going to be dropping ODA on them and, to the latest CVE, whatever, to go ahead and compromise them. It's the fundamentals where they fail and they get compromised. And this is absolutely the same when it comes to approaches to a pandemic. Pretty early on, folks were saying in the medical community that if people did things like washing their hands, making sure they didn't touch their face, which admittedly, I won't say that while it may be fundamental, it's very difficult to train yourself not to do, and wear masks and social distance, we can go ahead and absolutely kneecap this virus, not in that we'll eliminate it, but that we will completely contain the spread for that time. And early on, folks were talking about it as a way to give the hospitals time to react. But it also, now what we're facing, people call a second or a third wave, it can give a bit of a reset and allow us to ease restrictions. Now, they may come back, but it is absolutely key to doing that. And if you look at how people approached the fundamentals early on, people weren't focusing on that stuff. They were focusing on bright and shiny objects. What's a new medical treatment? What's a new way to sanitize and other things? You would go to a store and you'd see folks who had they were doing runs on toilet paper or runs on hand sanitizer. The runs on toilet paper, I don't know what people were thinking. Maybe they're thinking they could eat the toilet paper because the way people stocked up and continued to stock up, it's crazy. But on the hand sanitizer, people were looking at, like, I think the labels on the hand sanitizer, like, oh, it's 99.99% effective. I better get this stuff because it's going to kill all the things. I spray it on stuff and it's going to be, it's going to be magical. Well, it's not magical. I think in a lot of cases, they found that hand washing with soap for 20 to 30 seconds can be even more effective. hand sanitizer is a tool for when you don't have access to the other thing. But people were focused on the hand sanitizer and not getting soap. I know when I went, I would go to like a drugstore and I'd see people frantically searching for hand sanitizer, and then like in desperation they'll go and they'll buy an antibacterial soap. Yet the shelves were stocked with regular soap, and folks were just passing it by, like, no, 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 I don't need that. I need this other stuff because this is going to be more effective, when they weren't actually stopping and realizing, no, what's the fundamentals? Yes, there is a certain level of efficacy that you may get with the a hand sanitizer or an antibacterial soap, but the fundamentals of those basics are what's going to be key. The fundamentals aren't necessarily always the most enjoyable thing, and it's difficult to maintain that long term for a lot of folks, but they are absolutely key. So, I hope we can all keep that in mind as we go through this stuff. And the game has changed with regards to that, but it really hasn't. I'm going to flip the script here a little bit, in that I think this is something that InfoSec has seen to a certain degree with companies' reactions to the pandemic. So if you used to go into an office every day rather than working from home, suddenly you need to be able to work remotely all the time. So companies that were prepared for it and had formal ways for all of their employees to work remotely, they may, if they were actually well prepared, they will have gone and said, okay, go home, make sure your internet connection's okay, make sure you know how to access anything that may have been on-prem that you need, and we'll be good to go. Companies that didn't have a way to deal with that and didn't have a way to scale were frantically going ahead and potentially setting themselves up for compromise by just opening everything up to the world. Like, open up RDP to the world because I got to access this box that's only accessible on-prem, and we don't have a secure way to do it, but the business is going to die if we don't do this. And in some cases, they may have decided that the risk was justified in those cases, but I think they haven't necessarily made the proper preparations. What we are seeing today, this isn't the 90s. We have seen the need for this growing steadily over the past decade. And now we're seeing that come to a head. Everything that we've seen up until now is just getting intensified and sped up by the pandemic. But it really hasn't changed the overall approach that we should have. It may change the rollout. We may need to scale in a different way, but it's really the same as what we've been dealing with for quite a while now. And on that, I think big thing is being prepared. We can all be good Boy Scouts and make sure that we're properly prepared for what's going on. But as InfoSec professionals or hackers, we want to hope for the best, but plan for the worst. If we go ahead and plan for the worst and we don't need to go ahead and use it, great. But having that in our back pocket is fantastic. I know when the pandemic started for myself, I went ahead and a couple days into me being at home and working remotely, I took my EDC and I kind of like splayed it all out on a table, and I started looking, okay, what was in my EDC because it was a decent tool to be used on occasion on the go. What am I, certainly took out all the battery packs and everything else I needed only if I wasn't, somewhere near an outlet. Thankfully, I have plenty of outlets at home. Separate out, okay, this is going to be useful. Some stuff I'm going to need to replace. And it may have been something as simple as just getting a decent microphone, which I only kept at home, kind of a cheapo headset, getting a decent microphone and revisiting some skills that I hadn't touched in a while in terms of dealing with audio and video. But it can be lots of other stuff as well. On the pandemic side, strictly, I started taking a look and doing an inventory of what I had that would help me respond should I need to self-isolate. And I said, okay, what are the recommendations? What do I need? So immediately ordered a pulse oximeter, made sure I had some sort of temperature sensing equipment. I don't have like a child at home, so I don't necessarily have a bunch of thermometers and whatnot. And I actually realized that the best thermometer I had was a meat probe thermometer that I use in my oven. So hacker in me was like, okay, well, let's see how accurate this is and if it would work in a pinch. Turns out the accuracy of my meat thermometer was enough, but it's not something I want to rely on. Okay, so I ordered that stuff. And then I went out and I also stocked up on just basic medical supplies. Again, these are not the most exciting things to do. Go out and buy, antihistamines and just stuff like, I don't know, Tylenol, Advil, ibuprofen, stuff like that. Um, Making sure, based on medical recommendations, that they said, hey, if you think you have COVID, at least early on, they weren't recommending that you go out to get testing. They were saying, hey, be in touch with a medical professional, and you should be prepared to have some basic medications at home and track your temperature. And if conditions worsen, then you might need to go to a hospital. So having those on hand would allow me to react appropriately. It turned out that I guess fates were aligned. I needed to take advantage of that stuff within a few hours. Because actually, only a couple hours from when I got home from going out to shop for different things, I got a call that let me know that a friend of mine, who was one of the early cases in New Jersey, I had been exposed to him about half a week beforehand. And so, based on the fact that I was, in the same space as that person, within about 10 feet of them for about an hour, I now needed to shelter in place for another week and a half, since it had been half a week since I was exposed. And if I hadn't had my 2 weeks of food and everything else, there would have been, I would have freaked out then. But at that point, I'm like, hey, I'm happy I went out. The last thing I had to get were those, basic drugs, but I had that in place. And so the anxiety over needing to collect these supplies was, much lower because of that. So, proper preparations, whether it's a, formal run book or just going out and getting these basic supplies, the same things we want in InfoSec is ways that you can help address your needs during a pandemic. And along the way, hopefully you pick up a few new skills. I know, like I said, I've revisited some audiovisual skills. I did like college radio and did some video production work when I was younger. I've revisited a bunch of that stuff. It has turned into kind of its own little hobby, helping friends and family members with some stuff. And it is, it maybe, I think hackers love picking up new skills. And while these skills may not be as directly relatable to hacking as something like lockpicking or I don't know anything else like that, I think they're still useful skills. And the great thing about hackers is that we are constantly looking to pick up new skills and test those new skills. So don't be afraid of that. I embrace it. As we go ahead and react. And we're going ahead and forming how we're going to respond to things, we want to make sure that we understand that what we're really doing here is we're looking to reduce risk. By its very nature, we're not going to be able to eliminate risk entirely. That's true in InfoSec, and it's true in regards to how we're dealing with the pandemic. I know for myself, I'm certainly not a medical professional, and I've been learning a lot about how, they're saying, hey, we don't know the exact effectiveness rates of these particular precautions, but we know that taking certain precautions, basics, when you're dealing with stuff in the pandemic, it reduces the overall likelihood, and we can reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Now, that acceptable level is going to be different for everyone. For some folks, they may only be comfortable outside more than 6 feet apart from everybody. Other folks may be able to say, listen, I don't have any immunocompromised issues, don't have family members who are at higher risk either, so maybe I'll be willing to go indoors. There's a lot of stuff that's gone on with restaurants taking different approaches. You have to reduce risk to a level that's acceptable to you, but also understand that you're not going to eliminate risk entirely. Excuse me. And anyone who's coming along and saying that they're going to be able to eliminate the risk entirely is probably lying to you. And just like if a vendor comes in and says, 100% effective against all hackers and the APTs, it's not real. And understanding that reality, and to take something from the military, in a certain sense, embracing the suck a little bit, understanding that this is going to be with us for a little while, is important as well. But as we're going through this, we need to make sure that we maintain balance. To quote Thanos, what we are looking for is perfectly balanced, as all things should be. And as we're going ahead and crafting how we're going to approach a pandemic, we need to make sure that we maintain usability, because usability matters. What we're in here for is, an extended period. I think a lot of folks early on in the pandemic did not view this as, let's say, a new normal, viewed it as something where, hey, we could be through this in the next month or two, be through the worst of it, and then things will ease. So I'm going to act as if that's the amount of time that I need to take on these precautions for. So let me structure it that way. Well, as as hackers, as InfoSec professionals, we know that that's not really the way threats work. Threats do not go away instantaneously. They may lessen over time, but it's going to potentially take a while, and we need to make sure that we are prepared to maintain that for a long time. And we need to make sure that we have that usability so that we can fight burnout. This is a marathon, not a sprint. I think some folks thought that, hey, maybe it might not be over in a month or so, but 6 months, 7 months in, we'd probably be in a place where we had reached, call it a new normal, call it an acceptable level of risk or extra precautions. But it turns out that we haven't. And I think if you had taken on extra restrictions for yourself and others that were a little too tight, you may find yourself sliding to a place where you almost just give up. And we see this in InfoSec all the time. If you go ahead and put too tight restrictions on folks in an enterprise environment, a corporate environment, you're going to see folks react negatively to it and figure out ways around it. So in some cities where they've put heavily restrictive impositions on folks, they have reacted strongly and gone ahead and said, hey, I'm not doing this. And they may be hiding it from the public, but they're going ahead and working around the restrictions. So having something that is going to work for you, that's going to work for the long term, it's really something we need to keep in mind. And it is in the same way that it's going to be different for each individual, but we also need to be proactive and make sure that it's working for the folks, in our direct orbit. And that starts bringing me to, I think, some of the more proactive measures. We want to be proactive rather than reactive. So in a network environment, we might have network segmentation. Well, that works. That's perfectly applicable to what we're dealing with in a pandemic. On a basic level, what a lot of medical professionals are proposing with social distancing, well, that's complete network segmentation. Every individual node is completely segmented from one another, so it's highly unlikely that somebody's going to be able to pivot from one system to another. And that's great, but as time has gone on, well, there's a balance that has needed to be struck that's not full-on network segmentation. So what have we seen? Well, hey, maybe you need particular machines to be able to talk to one another on a network, but you don't want all machines to talk to each other. If you take a look at what some schools and other places have done, they've used what they're calling pods. So what's a school's approach with a pod? Well, we want to have students be able to return to in-person learning, but there's a unacceptable level of risk if every individual student is allowed to interact as they would normally with one another. So by creating pods of individual classes of students and keeping them together, so they try to maintain social distancing as much as possible, but they're going to have, ultimately, we know there's going to be closer interactions between those groups of students. But an individual class is not interacting with another class. They're only interacting with their own class. So if there is an outbreak, it is more likely to be able to be contained to that class, and the whole school does not need to shut down. Perhaps an individual class may need to shut down, but the whole school doesn't. This is, I mean, to me, it's clear as day. It's exactly the same as what we would try to do in network segmentation. And so let's look at other proactive measures that are, I guess, kind of similar. Well, vaccines. I think there is, when it comes to vaccines, we really should look at it as patch management for humans. There's a patch. It took some time, took a couple months for different drug companies to develop and test their patch for humans to give us sufficient antibodies to fight this disease. But now we're hearing that, hey, there's some vaccines that are in development, but the vaccines are not perfectly efficient. They're not going to give us 100% effectiveness. I think before the pandemic, I pretty much would have just assumed that, hey, they've tested it and maybe it's not 100% effective, but it's 99.99%. But we're learning that this Pfizer vaccine is potentially one of the most effective vaccines that folks have seen, because it's going to be 90% effective. Well, that means 1 out of 10 people it's not going to be effective for. Well, that's where that network segmentation comes into play. Because if we go ahead and we apply the patches to the folks that we can, and we have that network segmentation, that's what's going to hopefully get us to reduce the overall risk. Like patch management in an InfoSec situation, where we're applying the patches, how we're applying the patches, and what priority we apply the patches are all going to become vitally important. I think it's going to be interesting over the next few months to see how the vaccine is rolled out. And listen, you may need to do, it may not sound like the most comfortable thing in the world, but your own inventory management to understand this. Who am I going to interact with? Let's say I get the vaccine, but my friends and family have not. Am I going to go ahead and keep an inventory of who has it and who doesn't? And what's my overall risk? And am I going to be willing to accept that risk? But assuming that we have vaccines and we can layer some network segmentation on top of that, well, now we've gotten to what they call herd immunity, but in a certain sense, I think it's defense in depth. And I see somebody in chat saying, yeah, the side effects. There are definitely going to be side effects, and I think that's going to delay the rollout as well. We're going to see. That's why herd immunity is accomplished by defense in depth, because you're not going to be able to patch every system. You need certain availability on certain systems. So you need to be able to have different approaches depending on what we're dealing with. So by layering these different things, we can have that defense in depth and develop a situation, even with straight vaccination. If you have 90% effectiveness, I think they say overall, you need to get about 80% of a population with somewhere about 75% effectiveness of a vaccine in order to get to herd immunity. So there's different ways that we can go ahead and do this. So in the case of tying it back to defense in depth and patch management, you'll patch certain systems, but you may turn off services on other systems because you can't patch it, or there is no patch for a particular system, but it's still vulnerable. So there may be some folks who there is, a 20% chance of an adverse medical effect. So they'll continue social distancing, mask wearing, and other things until a point where everybody has reached herd immunity because they cannot be patched yet, or maybe they'll never be able to be patched. If you look at traditionally the way herd immunity is relied upon, there's always some folks who are going to be unable to to be vaccinated, and some folks who the vaccine will never be able to have an effect on. So it is direct parallels between the two there. And to that end, I think education is really key. I think some of what we've seen in response to the pandemic, education in some cases has been lacking. And listen, we see that in InfoSec a lot, security awareness training and continuing education for users. Users are the first line of defense. And it comes down to them to ultimately work with us or work against us to accomplish what we need to do. Going back earlier to the general concept for medical professionals, we go ahead and we say, hey, if everybody wears their masks and does these basic precautions, we can kneecap this virus, take it out. But end users were unwilling to accept that. I think part of it comes down to education. And if there is a better education, it can go ahead and make the effect better. I'd like to suggest that we should all take on some of this education. Different communication methods are going to work better for different folks. So, please speak with your friends and family and see, hey, are they understanding this? Are they doing their own threat modeling? But also, do they understand what's going on with the vaccination? If somebody's nervous about a vaccine, like, hey, maybe I can point you towards some real information about whether this is the correct approach for you or not. When it comes to this, the unfortunate side effect in the real world is that we also have to combat misinformation. And to me, that means, education isn't the end, it's the beginning. It's exactly the same way in InfoSec. Just because somebody attends security awareness training doesn't mean that they're now aware and they never need to revisit it. The threats are constantly evolving. Our approach needs to be constantly evolving, and it needs to go on over time. Combating misinformation and combating just incorrect interpretations of information is going to be key. So please speak with your friends and loved ones and help them understand, point them towards resources that they can use, and maybe offer to help walk them through that if you're comfortable with it, saying, hey, here's what we know, here's what we understand, and let's go ahead and figure out an approach that works for you. And if it's you're a family member and, hey, maybe we want to be able to interact more, maybe we want to form, maybe it's just a friend and, hey, we want to form a little pod and we want to know that our overall risk level is going to be acceptable. Let's make sure we're all on the same page. Let's make sure that we all understand the actual risks that we're dealing with. And this is where I think hackers also, just by necessity, have to reevaluate and constantly incorporate new information. And research skills, being able to learn new things, is vitally important. And this is something that the general public has sometimes struggled with. When early on in the pandemic, there's certain advice that's come out from medical professionals. And then later on, they say, well, hey, we've changed our advice and you should do things a little bit differently now. Well, some folks would look at it and be like, see, the medical people know nothing. Well, hey, we know they knew certain things at the time, and additional research has revealed different approaches and different may I see the last results of your vulnerability assessment before I allow you on-prem? Yeah, there's new things have come to light, man. There's a lot of new information always coming out at the time, and just because current information is contradicting something in the past doesn't mean that it's untrue. It's fine to be skeptical of it, but we should have a way to verify the information and incorporate new information and have, trusted news sources and trusted folks that we can consult to be able to get at the real information and differentiate what's going to be potentially misinformation from, true information. Right after Pfizer announced the efficacy of their vaccine, all of a sudden Russia was announcing, well, our vaccine's like, what is it, 92, 93% effectiveness. See, more effective than the US vaccine. I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But for me, from the sources that I trust, I don't see any way of being able to verify that vaccine is as effective as what they're saying. And certainly no information on verifying if it's anywhere near as safe as what Pfizer has developed. So incorporate new information, but make sure that you're doing it in a way that is intelligent and takes into account all of your knowledge as an InfoSec professional. And let's see if we can incorporate least privilege. We want to concept of least privilege, limiting your exposure by limiting who has access. Well, hey, that's directly applicable here. in a corporate environment, you see a lot of folks talk about least privilege as an approach that's going to be not something you're going to turn on immediately. It's a least privilege journey. And it may just be, that's the sort of thing that sounds nice, but that least privilege journey is real. You want to go ahead and take a look. Hey, here's the access I have. Is there another way I could do it that's potentially more secure? Or is this something that I don't really explicitly need? Obviously, we need to have that balance, but that balance may be different. Hey, maybe this is the general guidelines, but because of my own approach to things, I can be more restrictive for myself. I love going to movies, but I'm not going to movies during the pandemic because while the risk of infection at a movie theater is probably fairly low as long as there's social distancing and everything else, it's not a risk that I need to take. I can sit at home and watch a movie on TV, and that's perfectly acceptable to me for the foreseeable future. I'd love to see Tenet, but I'm not going to be able to see it. And that sucks, but hey, this is something I'm willing to live with. It may be that, hey, I'm unwilling to fans of going to live theater. I'm not willing to give that up, but maybe I'm not willing to give that up because I can find a way to do that safely. Can't do an indoor theater, but now there are theater companies that are conducting outdoors. So hey, I can substitute that where I have a less risky alternative. So please try to apply the concept of least privilege, and don't be afraid of, hey, I've pared back and I'm saying I'm not doing this stuff, then making a little more exception. It's not going to always be perfect. This is going to be a learning situation. You're going to adjust and adapt over time. If we can be super, super restrictive. You can go and live in your basement with some canned food and a bucket in the corner and never interact with another human being for the next year. Theoretically, you can, but what's that going to do to your mental health? And are you really prepared to do that? Probably not. There's always going to be gradations of what we're willing to do, what we're willing to accept. So even if you're going ahead and staying at home and only getting deliveries, there is a certain amount of risk to doing that. And in certain situations, it may be less risky for you to go out and go grocery shopping once every 2 weeks than get delivery every day. Take a hard look at it and don't be afraid to revisit it. And make sure you understand what your own risk tolerance is as you're going ahead and taking a look at this stuff. Last thing I want to bring up is tabletops. Proper preparation prevents poor performance. That's why we do tabletops. But I think when it comes to the pandemic, we can use tabletops to take a look at what we're likely to encounter. Now, I don't expect everybody to have a COVID response IR playbook, but if you can go ahead and tabletop different scenarios that you're likely to encounter, I think you're more likely to have less anxiety about decision making in the moment, and you're more likely to go ahead and actually act in situations where, hey, you might have wished you reacted differently after the fact. Tabletop scenario, if you're just something that everybody pretty much is doing, going to the grocery store occasionally. If I'm in line at the grocery store checking out and somebody's encroaching on the 6 feet between people, is that a level of risk I'm willing to accept if that person is wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask? What is the level where, hey, this is an increased level of risk, but I'm okay with it, versus this is an increased level of risk and I'm going to walk away? Know what your limit is ahead of time. And if you walk into a grocery store and you see everybody's not wearing masks and you're not okay with that, okay, that's the point where I'm going to put the put the basket down and I'm going to walk out and hopefully not have anxiety over it because I've gamed it out ahead of time. When we go ahead and also think through conversations you're going to have with Thanksgiving and other holidays coming up, a lot of folks are going to have what unfortunately I think are some uncomfortable conversations with friends and family members. If a family member says, "Hey, I haven't seen you in so long, please come for Thanksgiving. Want to go ahead and see you." Think through that ahead of time. Everybody has their own threat model, and everybody has their own risks that they're willing to accept. So understanding ahead of time, if you go ahead and know that, hey, okay, I'm willing to go ahead and go to this family member's home, but I'm not willing to eat inside. Well, hey, I live in New Jersey. It's getting pretty cold outside. The likelihood that we're going to be able to eat outside based on how cold it is, it's pretty unlikely. If you live out in sunny Southern California, yeah, that may work, and that may work for you. But think through it ahead of time, because in the moment, there's going to be all sorts of stuff flowing through your head. So, please think about it. Make sure you understand how you're going to react, why you're going to react. And there's going to be scenarios that you're not going to think through, but think through as many of them as you can. And I think tabletops also bring into play all of the different skills that I've been bringing up throughout this, whether it be threat modeling, risk analysis, how you're going to deal with network segmentation, and all the rest. It kind of ties everything together. And I think the more aspects of life that we can go ahead and take that hacker mindset and apply it to, we'll be better off for it, and we won't just survive, we'll thrive. And so with that, that is the presentation. Thank you so much for having me speak here. It's great to be back at BSides Delaware. Always enjoy my time at BSides Delaware. Really looking forward to the conference as a whole. Thank you everybody for working so hard to play this out. Really super excited to see things succeed, see things fail, learn and innovate from it. So I'm Spam. If you want to reach me online, that's my contact info. Have a great con, everybody.